Mr. President, dear colleagues, on Monday here in the Assembly chamber, our colleague Frank Schwabe, along with more than 30 members of the Assembly, challenged the still unratified credentials of the Azerbaijani delegation on substantive grounds on the basis of Article 8 of the Rules of Procedure of our Assembly. He cited, among other things, political prisoners in the country, the violent displacement of people from Nagorny Karabach, cases of lack of cooperation with the Assembly rapporteurs, and the lack of an invitation to the Assembly to observe the country's 7th February presidential election. Therefore, in line with Article 8.3 of the Rules of Procedure, the Monitoring Committee has seized for a report on substantial grounds and adopted a report on this yesterday. I would like to recall that at the committee's meeting in Rome last December, it adopted a report honouring the commitments and obligations by Azerbaijan. The report has already been tabled but has not yet been published on the Assembly's website, since 2 days after the adoption of this report, the President of the Republic of Azerbaijan announced a snap presidential election scheduled for 7th of February 2024. Therefore, the report is not yet in the public domain but will be published shortly after the snap presidential election and discussed in the Assembly during the April part session. In acceding to the Council of Europe on 25 of January 2001, the Republic of Azerbaijan has agreed to honour several specific commitments which are listed in the Assembly resolution and has accepted the obligations incumbent on all member states under Article 3 of the Statutes of the Council of Europe. Compliance with the principles of pluralist democracy and the rule of law, as well as respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms of all persons placed under its jurisdiction. Unfortunately, more than 20 years after joining the Council of Europe, Azerbaijan has still not fulfilled major commitments stemming from its membership of our organisation. Very serious concerns remain as to its ability to conduct free and fair elections, the separation of powers, the weakness of its legislature vis-à-vis the executive, the independence of the judiciary, and respect for human rights, as illustrated by numerous judgments of the European Court of Human Rights and opinions of the Venice Commission. In particular, the issue of the numerous political prisoners has not been resolved, although it was already problematic at the time of the country's accession to the Council of Europe. According to the credible NGOs reports, as of 1st of December 2023, there were 254 political prisoners in Azerbaijan. Therefore, the systemic issue of using criminal prosecution against government critics has not been resolved, despite the Assembly's resolution on reported cases of political prisoners in Azerbaijan of January 2020. Moreover, this evening, our chamber will debate a report on the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights on allegations of systematic torture and inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment in places of detention in Europe, which refers to some shocking cases of torture by law enforcement authorities in Azerbaijan, including the so-called Tatar cases. Myself, also being the Assembly's General Rapporteur on media freedom and safety of journalists, is particularly concerned about the increased number of violations of freedom of expression, illustrated namely by the recent wave of arrests of journalists from the independent Absas media outlet. It started with the arrest of Ulvi Hasanli and two of his collaborators on the 20th and 21st of November. In January, two other Absas journalists, Nargis Absalamova and Ilanara Gasimova, as well as Hafiz Babali, the financial editor of the news agents Turan, were arrested and placed in pre-trial detention in connection with the Absas case. And the same is the case for 5 other journalists. This only confirms the worrying trend of arbitrary arrests of government critics, which was spotted in the monitoring report of our committee and in a report by the Culture Committee on Media Freedom, which will be debated in the Assembly tomorrow. Since our colleague Frank Schwabe also referred to the recent events concerning Nagorno Karabakh, I can only recall that last year the Assembly adopted 2 resolutions on this subject based on reports of the Migration Committee. Besides these substantive issues, there have been flagrant cases of non-cooperation with the Assembly from the Azerbaijani side. In particular, our committee's rapporteurs on Azerbaijani were not allowed to meet the persons detained on allegedly politically motivated charges during the 2 visits to Baku in 2023. Moreover, the Assembly has not been invited to observe the forthcoming presidential election, despite Azerbaijan's obligation to send such an invitation to the country because it's under monitoring procedure. And these refusals are a clear lack of cooperation in the Assembly's monitoring procedure in the meaning of Rule 282b. And furthermore, the Azerbaijani delegation did not cooperate with the rapporteur of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, Mrs. Hannah Badel, and our rapporteur from the Migration Committee, Mr. Paul Gavan, who could not access the Lachin corridor. So conclude, all these issues cast serious doubt as to the compliance of the Republic of Azerbaijan with its commitments and obligations to the Council of Europe. Under the rules, the Assembly must vote for one of 3 options: to ratify the credentials, not to ratify them, or to ratify them together with depriving or suspending the exercise of some of the rights of participation or representation of members of the delegations. Myself, and the Monitoring Committee have reflected on all these options, and the gravity of human rights violations and the non-observance of basic principles of pluralist democracy and the rule of law convince me that the sanctions for such serious and long-lasting disrespect for the country's statutory obligations cannot be symbolic. But the cited cases of non-cooperation with the Assembly only can reinforce this conviction. And therefore, the conclusion of the Monitoring Committee is that the Assembly should not ratify the credentials of the Azerbaijani delegations. An amendment was tabled to this report, adding that the delegation may resume its activities in the Assembly when conditions provided by the rules of procedure are met. And this morning, during the Monitoring Committee meeting, I supported this amendment and the committee approved it unanimously. And I think it is important, as this amendment does, to leave the door open, of course, for the Azerbaijani delegation in case there is an improvement regarding the country's compliance with the basic principles of the Council of Europe and the obligations and commitments stemming from its membership of our organisation, as well as its cooperation with our Assembly. So, on these grounds, I of course sincerely hope that we will have a good debate and you all will support our draft resolution. Thank you very much for your attention.